Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren. I am the chief economist here at American Compass, and today we are talking with Karl Zinsmeister, who's the former director of the White House Domestic Policy Council back in the George W. Bush administration, and also of relevance to us, recently the author of a new book, Backbone: Maverick Essays in Praise of Middle America. I was very excited to talk to Karl because I think certainly for me and for many folks on the new right, the George W. Bush era it's sort of a black hole, might be a little bit harsh. Maybe blind spot is more appropriate. But we know what was going on with Reagan and we know what's going on now. And it's not clear what the W era was all about. And I think Karl is someone who does a really nice job sort of describing what was going on then, what they were thinking. And, frankly, for better and worse, underscores the ways that sort of thinking has helped transition toward today's world and also was maybe an obstacle to it. You'll see some points of agreement and also plenty of points of disagreement between the two of us as we talk. So I think you'll find that really interesting. I certainly learned a lot from it. But before we get to that, you must, of course, go check out Commonplace, or at least listen to me tell you to check out Commonplace. I wanted to mention especially two features we ran this week that I really liked. One was by Ethan Dodd, who was on the ground in Western Pennsylvania reporting on the presidential election and did a nice job for us kind of reflecting on that experience and what working class voters hope to see from Trump and then after Trump. And then the other one from our new economics editor, Mike Lind, on the German economy. I think we're seeing increasing concern about its performance. To what extent does that or does that not have to do with its labor policy, its industrial policy? No one better than Mike Lind to break that down for all of us. So check those out. Of course, be subscribing to Understanding America. We just had our two most liked pieces ever, one on Disney World and one on tax policy. So you can tell we are right in our sweet spot there. Lots more coming up, every Monday and every Friday. So understandingamerica.co, go subscribe. But for now, here's Karl Zinsmeister. And Karl Zinsmeister, welcome to the podcast.
Yes, happy to be with you, Oren, and with your audience. I'm looking forward to it.
They, I think, have a lot to learn from you. I was really struck when I read the essay in the Wall Street Journal based on your new book called Backbone: Why American Populism Should Be Welcomed, Not Feared. And I think perhaps a maybe surprising, we will see perspective coming from someone who, spent so much time in the W. Bush administration really shaping policy in that era, which is an era that I think is a real blind spot for the new right and younger conservatives. And certainly for me, I think everyone knows about Reagan and loves or hates that and talks about it. And now everyone's contrasting that with Trump. But there was an entire era in between. And so would love to sort of dive in on that a little bit and get your thoughts as someone who was central to it about, what was going on then. What do you think that era has in common with what we see going on now within conservatism, where some of the starkest differences are? And so I guess let's just start, give the audience a little bit of a background. What were you up to in the 2000s?
Sure. During the run-up to the Bush administration, I was running a magazine. I was running a center-right magazine. It actually, at one point, became, just as I kind of completed my work there, we were the largest circulation conservative monthly in the country. So we built up a great audience, and it gave me an excuse, Oren, to do a lot of traveling. So I spent a lot of time banging around our amazingly diverse and interesting country, and got to talk to a lot of regular folks, as well as a lot of experts and members of the pointy-headed class, and it really gave me I think a good feeling for the range of talents and the range of problems in the country. And very unexpectedly, as I was leaving the magazine in 2003, I got a call from the White House, and they said, "Would you be interested in being the president's domestic policy advisor?" And let me just confess right up front, I have always been a kind of ideas in politics person. That's been my specialty, and I kind of am very proud of the kind of record I built there. But I'm not a horse race politics guy, and I never was really interested in being in administrations or taking parts in elections. So this came very much out of the blue for me and was a bit of a surprise. But I I had been spending a lot of time in Iraq. Prior to that, I'd spent much of the prior 2 or 3 years embedded with soldiers in Iraq. Wrote 3 different books and did a PBS movie during that time, and it gave me a kind of a new idea of duty and of national service. I was just spending time with guys who were giving up so much of their family life, so much of their professional life, to kind of do something hard that needed to be done. When the president called, I was living in a bucolic little village in upstate New York. My children were still in school. The last thing I wanted to do was uproot myself and go back to Washington, D.C., which is not my favorite city in the world. But my wife really grabbed me by the lapels and said, "You got to take this seriously. If the president says he needs you, and you need to think hard about it and not be so selfish." And that kind of turned me around. So anyway, I had a chat with the president and had a very interesting. I had nothing to lose. I really didn't want the job, so I just went down there completely loose and sat at the Resolute desk with him and had an amazing conversation. So I ended up accepting the position and became the chief domestic policy advisor to the president, working in the West Wing. As I say, nothing I ever expected. In a kind of a professional way, Oren, I was very well prepared for that. Being a magazine editor forces you to know a little bit about everything. And that's kind of what the domestic policy advisor has to do. I had purview over, a dozen different cabinet or cabinet equivalent agencies, a couple $1 trillion worth of spending. It's a big, broad waterfront. And I felt intellectually very well equipped for that. The inside baseball part, again, that's never been my thing. I was not the guy to go to the Senate and bend my elbow with people and schmooze. But there are other parts of the White House that did that well. So it was interesting. I was happy to flee there at high speed back to rural America when I was done, but I'm proud of what we did for 3 years. And you're right. I think it's a misunderstood time. And I want to get back to that. But first, let me say that the early 2000s, which is what we're talking about here, were, in my view, really what's the right word? It's not decadent, but they were an exhausted time in America. I really feel like on both the left and the right, most of the politicians, when you started to talk to them, that little tape recorder in the back of your head would go off and they would start spouting this kind of very predictable, kind of completely conventional wisdom, whether it's from the left or from the right. There was very little fresh thinking or authenticity or real, kind of novelty taking place. Almost no social invention, which is what I prize. That's the thing I've always really been interested in, is how do you fix old problems in new ways? And so it was a kind of as I say, an exhausted and a little bit of a depressing time, I think, for everybody. And I'm not going to claim that anything wonderful happened, during that time. Obviously, George Bush got dragged into all sorts of things that he didn't expect to be in. Katrina, the Iraq War, and to a large extent, all of us in the administration, were in that same boat, where we ended up being much more focused on things that we didn't expect or intend to be focused on. But I think the administration generally did a pretty competent job. When the financial emergency came along, I kind of thanked my lucky stars that Bush was in office. I'll tell you honestly, Oren, we did some horrible things that I just hated doing. And we can get into detail on that if you want. But I think they were the right things to do because we were in such a national emergency. I mean, if you remember, the stock market was just going down by thousands of points. There was a real legitimate chance that the economy was going to tank. And the fact that a kind of a cautious person like Bush was in office with an advisor like Bernanke, who was one of the world experts in exactly this kind of a financial meltdown, was just godsend. And for all of the kind of crappy things we had to do with TARP and with bailing out certain companies, I'm absolutely certain it would have been vastly worse if most other of the teams I can think of were in office. So we all kind of held our nose and did things we had to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you describe those decisions as sort of crappy and horrible and also right, which perhaps speaks to some of the ideological undercurrents of the era. But I think your description of the period as sort of exhausted and lacking in innovation, it certainly resonates with me and sort of helps to explain to some extent why it is the sort of the dark ages, in a sense, of ideological development, probably on the left and the right to a significant degree. If you were to try to define that ideology, W ran on what he called compassionate conservatism. I mean, it's also fascinating to sort of go back to the America of 2000 and think about, probably the very peak of its geopolitical hegemony, the peak of the dot-com bubble, booming, end of an incredible run in the economy. Frankly, remarkable that Al Gore lost that election, but the question of sort of what Republicans were running on, what they represented, what they wanted to do. I think probably it's safe to say now it would be hard for someone to answer that question. At the time, there was certainly an attempt made. How would you define it? What would you say, the W. Bush administration was trying to carry forward from the Reagan era ideologically, or where was it trying to change at all?
Well, let's start with the truth that Reagan cast a huge shadow. I mean, he really was a kind of a transformative president, not a fully transformative one. We can return to that, but he had a big influence, and both on the left and the right, people were acting against him and people supporting him, I think, really kind of cemented a lot of their thinking right then. And that was appropriate at the time, but it went on way too long. And there was a kind of a hagiography of Reagan, a kind of a veneration of Reagan that I thought was destructive, not because anything he said or did was wrong, but that the world moves on. And 20 years later, the issues are not the same. And tax cuts are not the solution to every single problem. So I think partly this was a kind of a natural aspect of human nature, and that we kind of reach a formative age and we settle on a worldview and we get stuck. And it's very hard for any of us to kind of turn things over and go to the next page. That's something I think all of us need to really struggle and work hard at, to not get kind of stuck in a rut. As you say, Oren, both parties were very much stuck in a rut. That said, I think there were definitely some really good things about the George W. Bush era, and some places where he was a real innovator. And a lot of them, interestingly, kind of center around my theme of populism, which is the topic of my latest book. First of all, let's acknowledge that George Bush W. was, in a very strange way, the original populist. I mean, he grew up the grandson of a Connecticut senator and the son of a vice president, and it would have been very easy for him to sort of just step into that silver spoon mantle and live and act and govern that way. But he really didn't. I want to just remind our listeners that he grew up, his formative teenage years were spent in Midland, Texas. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Midland. It is the last place on earth you would consider glamorous or anything close to the conventional wisdoms of liberal America. It's on the plains. It's a hard, tough, super capitalist, very neighborly, very religious, very frontier influenced part of our nation, and that really had a big influence on W. He never stepped away from that. And when he, as an adult, chose his kind of dream, community to set down roots, he went to again, a very sparse ranch in East Texas, in Crawford. And, I remember all the journalists when we were in the White House moaning that the summer White House couldn't be in, Austin or someplace where they could get good sushi, that why did George W. want to live out in Crawford, in the God knows middle of nowhere? But that's who he was. That's what he loved. That's the kind of people he liked. That's the kind of terrain that he kind of felt at home in. So again, in a kind of visceral way, Bush was an original populist. And that wasn't just in the superficial kind of, where I'm from way. I mean, his language, if you remember, drove the journalists and his opponents nuts. And it drove me a little bit nuts. And when we wrote speeches, there was just no tolerance for anything flowery or fancy. He just wanted to be a what you see is what you get kind of guy. That's just the feeling he had in his heart. I identify with the Secret Service agents and the cops and the pilots around me. I don't identify with the PhDs and the people with complicated vocabularies. He just had this very instinctual kind of man of the people impulse in his breast. And that showed up in some of his policies. For instance, you mentioned the compassionate conservative thing. I think that was one of his better innovations. And it wasn't just a matter of kind of effective problem solving. And it was. I mean, if you're solving a problem like addiction, Oren, you know, all of the university created programs and the medicalized programs have had almost no success in beating addiction. What has had success in beating addiction is life transformation through faith. It is the most powerful tool we know for making that kind of a change. If you're talking about reknitting families together, if you're talking about getting people to take responsibility for neighborliness, religion is a very, very powerful medicine, a very powerful policy lever. So it was, first of all, savvy and cagey as a practical decision. But to return to the populist theme, he was also very populist. He's basically saying that the little old ladies in the Methodist church circle know more about how to deal with a bereft, woman facing a pregnancy than the social work department of Tufts University. That was literally the calculus. He's saying that these people have social wisdom in the churches. The people have wisdom and have judgments and have experience that needs to be at the table when we're fixing our deepest social problems. So again, a very populist decision, a very wise decision. So, Bush, I think, was in many ways a forerunner in ways that got lost because of the massive gush of the Iraq War problems and the Katrina problems and the economic meltdown problems.
Yeah, it's interesting to sort of tease apart what that definition of populism suggests, because I think it aligns well with, in a lot of cases, what folks would sort of describe as a folk libertarianism, the sort of distrust of central power, a preference for local control, local solutions, religion and cultural, approaches to addressing problems. It seems to me that the populism that we are talking about today in the U.S. is a little bit different in a lot of respects. It certainly has some elements of that, and if we look at what the Trump administration is doing early on in this term, there's an awful lot of ripping down centralized institutions. But I think the populism, as it gets, what people mean when they talk about it today is in part a skepticism not just of the elite sort of PhDs in the government, but also a real frustration with how elites broadly in the business community, in the economy, and so forth, have arguably damaged a lot of other facets of the country as well. It seems to me that on that front, W was a more conventional conservative with a sort of almost entirely Chamber of Commerce aligned agenda. Do you think is that fair, or does that miss an element of him as well?
No, that's very fair. That's very fair. And I'll just give you a little kind of very ad hominem example of that. W was a big admirer of Anthony Fauci. And then that was before Fauci showed a lot of his true colors. But I never liked the guy from the get-go. I never trusted him. I felt like he was a power mongerer and very arrogant from the minute I first started seeing what he was up to. But so I don't think you're wrong. I think that, again, W was a transitional figure. And I think some of this extreme arrogance and danger of the elite culture right at the cultural level that you've just described, Oren, was in the process of being revealed. We hadn't fully seen that yet, how pernicious it was, how deep-rooted it was, and what it ultimately leads to. As when COVID came along and the BLM riots came along, and you began to see how intensely, really smug and dangerous this kind of leave it to me, let the authorities, let the scientists, let the experts decide, we'll figure it out and tell you what to do. How really upsetting and dangerous that was, I think, wasn't entirely clear. So, today we are in a very different place. I think you're right. It's a much deeper, wider, broader populism. But these things and these cultural moments develop over generations. And one of the things I do in Backbone, in my book about populism, I really start back in the mid 90s. Actually, earlier than that, I quote George Wallace's wonderful line where he said that Americans are tired of having, pseudo intellectuals strutting around telling them how to run their family life. That was 1968. And, he got 10 million votes for that, shocked a lot of people. And it went from there, and it kind of built and it built and it built. And Reagan was a populist very much in the economic realm, but he was not a cultural populist. He too was, impressed with the credentials of the credentialed class. And I would like to be impressed with the credentials of the credentialed class. I would like to trust them to make decisions, but they've shown themselves not to be trustworthy. They've made some absolutely egregious, some really terrible judgments that make me and a lot of other Americans very suspicious of handing over the car keys to this class. And what most of my book is about, what Backbone is really about, is, I talk about how bad the elites have been, but that's not really what I spend most of my time on. Most of my time is spent going to middle America and saying, look around you, take a close examination of what you're seeing, and note the deep experience and deep wisdom and the strong intuition that is in the breasts of these everyday Americans. And this isn't some sort of romance, Oren. I'm not just like rabble rousing against PhDs or saying that, more education is worse. I don't believe any of that. But there's a very strong case to be made from history that what we would now call crowdsourcing, which is to say, trust everyday people. Let thousands of everyday people make decisions instead of anointing a very small class of so-called experts and letting them decide. That is really wise. That's how nature works. That's how American history has worked. That's how world history has worked. That the best, most successful institutions have relied on a broad base of knowledge and judgment and wisdom rather than letting experts decide. That was really where our founders went. Our founders, Madison and others, did a profound study of prior history. And they saw time and again in Rome and Greece and other places where what happens? You eventually have a coup. You have very smart people. And let's admit, these are very smart people, very energetic people. In their own way, they're very dedicated. And they convince themselves that they are the solution to all of our problems. And all I need to do is agglomerate more power in the corner of me and my buddies and get those riffraff out of the picture, those everyday ignoramuses out of the picture, and I can fix everything. This is a common human impulse that goes back thousands of years. And our founders said that's really dangerous, and that leads to really bad things. That, yes, everyday people make errors, of course. But if you have millions of people making errors, the extremes cancel each other out, and you eventually end up with a very usually a sensible consensus. Whereas if you have 100 people, running everything as you did in communist societies or Nazi societies or other autocracies, you can get wild swings to terrible places where millions of people suffer and die. And so it's a very prudential judgment, I think, that our founders made to trust ordinary Americans.
Yeah, so I think that's exactly what I think jumps out from the book is as you said, this kind of focus on what the ordinary American brings to the table in a sense, and why our government and nation are in fact fortunately set up to privilege that. I think it's very interesting to see, for all of our troubles in the U.S., how much better we are weathering these contemporary crises than, for instance, European countries or Japan in a lot of ways that just are not societally, politically set up to accommodate and respond to people in the way that we are. The challenge, I think, where the rubber meets the road, especially for policymakers, then is, okay, how do we draw the line? What are the things that therefore we in fact need to loosen the grip on and leave back to those local communities, versus what are the places where we do need, those local communities are in fact counting on us to get some stuff right at the national level. And so I'm curious how you think about that in the context of, thinking about in current political scene issues like, trade, like immigration. I think there's a worldview and probably fairly well represented in kind of the old right conservative establishment that seizes these insights and then uses them to say, well, and that's why we just need free trade and open borders, because if you leave everyone to their own devices, we get the best outcome. Obviously, as I'm framing the question, I am skeptical of that, but I'm curious how you apply kind of the core insight then to the question of some of these debates that we're having at the national level.
You know, I think one of the first starting points, Oren, needs to be that you want to push down authority and decision-making rights to the people who are kind of on the ground and closest to the experience. So, for instance, when I was in the White House, we would have to wrestle with issues of, who are the best teachers? How do you know which teachers are the good ones who should be rewarded, and who are the bad ones who should be dumped? Who are the best doctors? And again, how do you create some sort of a hierarchy that recognizes the good medical care and the less good medical care? And, the first thing that I think you notice is that those are incredibly difficult decisions to make from an office in Washington. You just don't have the data or the experience or the wherewithal to differentiate. But everyday people make those decisions all the time. You know what the best teachers are in your children's school. I certainly did, and I don't even know how I knew. But there is this whole kind of aquarium full of water that all around you, that you notice little things, you pick up on things. I don't have 100% unerring judgment on which the best doctors are, but I would rather choose my doctor myself than have it assigned by some guy with a PhD in an office in Washington, because I go and I talk to them. I look at things. I check their credentials. I talk to the other people who dealt with them. Those kinds of decisions, again, are never going to be bulletproof and made in a 100% accurate way by anybody. But to the extent that you can push the judgment down to the level of the person actually experiencing the transaction, you will do much better. Another thing I think we have to have as a general principle. I'm sorry, you wanted to jump in there?
Well, I think that it's a helpful focus on sort of these places where this point of view is most useful, in things like, education reform and things like healthcare reform. It seems to me that's not really where the debates are focused right now. And so that's why I was curious about issues like, things related to globalization, so trade and immigration. Right. Or, to your point about the financial crisis, financial markets is another really interesting example. But it seems to me that one of the struggles of the sort of 2000s era conservatism was that in its focus on, No Child Left Behind, on market-driven healthcare reform, the ideology was sort of left with nothing to say on some of these bigger issues that have become so important. And so I do want to push you a little bit on, so like, where do we go on those issues from your starting point? Where does that lead you on a question like trade or immigration?
Well, let's start with immigration, for instance. I mean, I spent a lot of time on immigration, both prior to my White House years, and I also produced almost all of the research that kind of went behind the 2007 immigration reform proposal, which is much better than most people realize. And I think that's a good example, Oren, that the people, the kind of the populist consensus was actually pretty darn good and not far off. And we didn't need an expert class to kind of really make the final judgments there. Now, that's weird for me to say, because I was part of the expert class on that. Again, I helped write that bill. But here's how that played out for me. We recognized going in that the primary problem with immigration in this country is not that Americans are anti-immigration. Quite the contrary. Most Americans are well disposed to having hardworking immigrants come to this country, strive, and go shoulder to shoulder with the rest of us to make the place better. We've seen that happen over and over in our own families and elsewhere. But Americans are also really put off by line jumpers and by people who don't respect the rule of law, and who think that they don't that they are an exception to kind of an orderly system of governance. And so what had happened in prior immigration reforms, the Simpson-Mazzoli and others in the 80s, was there were grandiose promises made that we'll get control of that illegality problem. Don't you worry, just leave it to us. And in the meantime, we're going to legalize all the illegals who are here now, and we're going to open the spigots for future increases in legal immigration. And Americans believed that. They bought that. They agreed to that, and that reform passed. And then guess what happened? The Washington class absolutely abrogated all of those promises to get control of the border and to really have an orderly process. And it became an extremely disorderly process again, where we were getting way more people over the border illegally than we were accepting through our legal channels. And that pissed people off, and rightly so. Now, we recognize that in the White House. I mean, nobody in Congress, or a lot of the left, at least in Congress, refused to even buy that logic. But we, in the White House, we knew that that had happened and that that was a risk. So, for instance, we set up an elaborate system of triggers where you don't get any of the goodies on immigration until you have done the hard thing. So you had to hire border guards, and you had to put up wall, and you had to have an e-verify system, which made it difficult for employers to hire illegals. And once those things were in place, then we would consider the status of people who are in limbo in this country. Then we might consider increasing meritocratic immigration in a positive way on a legal basis. So there was this very delicate and I think correct emphasis on encouraging the good aspects of immigration, but first establishing the rule of law and ending the bad aspects of immigration, which were bringing in people we just didn't need as a country. People not only who had criminal records, which has been a big emphasis of Trump, but literally most of the people coming into this country for the last generation have had no high school education. That's not entirely who we need. I don't mind having some of those folks come in, but we need nurses, and we need, all kinds of specialists and people willing to start businesses. And so we have to have a more balanced, more carefully selected pool of immigrants. And so again, we put this together, this pretty interesting balanced proposal. And one of the things I was most proud about is we really introduced the concept of meritocratic immigration for the first time. So we set up a point system where if you knew English, you got points. If you had business experience, you got points. If you were willing to Americanize quickly and take classes on that regard, you got points. If you had important skills, and they don't all have to be educated skills. We also need welders. We need carpenters. We need all kinds of things like that. But if you have those useful skills, you got points. So we set up for the very first time the idea that Americans should choose in a savvy, careful way who we make our next co-citizens. We shouldn't just say anybody who calls themselves a refugee is allowed by law to walk in. Anybody who's related to an existing person who is already here is allowed to walk in. That's the current system, by the way. I don't know if Americans realize that, but if you're the brother of somebody who's here right now, you can walk in pretty much. So that's a silly and foolish system, and we recognize that. But the problem was we were dealing with cynicism. The American public had been so burned by this bait and switch, by these lies of previous immigration reforms that did not get control of the rule of law problem, that they couldn't believe our too good to be true promises. And frankly, as disappointing as that was for me, as one of the architects, I didn't blame them, and I didn't think it was absurd. So even there, Oren, which you could argue is an important place where expertise has to play a role, and I agree with that. But even there, the kind of knee-jerk impulse of average Americans was pretty sane, and really was helpful, actually, rather than harmful to getting things right in the long run.
Yeah, it's an interesting example. I mean, the politics, I guess, 2007 again in 2013 of the kind of grand bargain immigration reform. To your point, in the structure of the proposals, tried to incorporate, certainly commitment to rule of law and so forth. Ultimately, both were tanked by a essentially quite populist refusal to believe that this was actually what people were committed to doing. Right. Probably in part, and I think facilitated by the fact that it's not clear how committed people were to it. The financial crisis then is another fascinating example, and you touched on it. I'm curious what your interpretation of that era is, even kind of in the lead up. I mean, obviously the popping of the bubble is the dramatic moment, but there was essentially a period of excess from 2004 to 2007, roughly, that created the conditions. What is your interpretation of how that happened and what led to the crisis?
I would blame a lot of so-called American elites for that whole crisis. I mean, let's admit, first of all, that it started with some very grassroots populist impulses. People want to own their own home, all right? And that's a good thing. And, people want to have their own small businesses, and they want to own stocks, and they want to do a lot of things that are socially desirable. But politicians and other leaders pandered to those instincts in really egregious ways that are unconscionable looking back. The whole Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, pouring gasoline onto the fire, encouraging people to basically eliminate underwriting standards for mortgages and just hand them out, in cereal boxes, more or less, was unbelievable. And it was not populists who engineered that. It was people like Franklin Raines, who was the head of Fannie Mae, who was, he was the golden boy, or one of the golden boys in the Democratic Party, and came in, and I think he was paid $90 million, if I remember, to run Fannie Mae. Absolutely scandalous, kind of back scratching, skid greasing behavior. We had one of the insiders of the insiders put in this very powerful position, and then he basically just opened the floodgates and said to banks, we want you to write a mortgage for everybody and don't get too scrupulous about details. And that eventually bore horrible fruit. So it was a combination of a populist pandering, but it was really a maladministration by an elite class that caused that disaster. And as I've already said, Oren, a lot of us, to kind of stem the bleeding after this all blew up and literally threatened to take down millions of innocent bystanders, we did a lot of things that we wouldn't normally like to do. Let me give you a very specific example, and this is almost never reached the news. So this, I think, will be new to a lot of your audience, but everyone knows about the mortgage market meltdown. What nobody knows about, and I'm very proud of this because it's basically because my team handled this off the record, was there was also a student loan market meltdown. We were very, very close to a huge failure in the student loan market, which is hundreds of billions of dollars. What was happening there was very similar to what happens in mortgages on one level, which is that the banks that give out student loans don't hold them. They don't keep them on the books. They write the loan, they package them with thousands of other loans, and they sell that as a security to investors. So it's handed off. And when they sell last year's loans in a package, that's the money that they use to write next year's loans, okay? So when the whole credit market just collapsed and nobody was willing to buy anybody's packaged loans, these banks had no money to write the loans for the coming school year. Now, this was not like the mortgage market in that there were irresponsible, derelict borrowers who had no income, no jobs, no assets, and were just playing at being a homeowner. In this case, these were students and their families who were not irresponsible in any way, but they were about to be collateral damage. They were about to get the message literally weeks before they were starting their college that, oops, I'm sorry, the student loan market is locked and we're not going to be able to give you your loan. You're going to have to just skip a year. This would have been a disaster for millions and millions of families and completely unculpable. This is not their fault. So when I finally figured this out, I realized we're not going to let that happen. This is not those people's problem. This is a side effect of a much larger crisis. We have to get involved there. That's what a government has to do once in a while, kind of a wartime scenario. This was an economic wartime scenario, in my opinion. And we've got to make it possible for those families to follow through with their educational expectations. So we did something that I normally would never do, is that we basically set up a kind of it's a complicated thing, but we set up a conduit, we called it, which would do what these banks were otherwise doing privately. They would package their loans from last year, put them into this conduit, and we would put government guarantees on the conduit so that private investors would buy those packaged student loans and the banks would have the money to make next year's loans. That's grossly simplified, but it was a very complicated piece of financial engineering. I was uncomfortable with it because it was a derivative of exactly the sort that got us into the mess. I mean, it was these so-called derivatives, these secondhand financial instruments that really caused the explosion in 2007, 8, 9. And here, ironically, we were creating a new derivative to get out of the hole. But that's what it took right then. And we tried to do it in a responsible way. We made sure that this sunset after we did it for a few years so that we could go back to a healthier situation. But that was the kind of calculus that was necessary. And, again, I'm proud of my role in that. That was expertise behind the scenes. There is a role for experts. I'm not arguing that we need to be a society that just puts every single, jot and tittle of government decision into an election box and lets everyday people decide, because some things you can't decide. frankly, we kept this secret as long as we could, Oren. If this had become known, if it had become known that the student loan market was also about to melt down, there would have been another panic. And you could say, well, that's not very democratic to kind of keep this off the record. But our judgment was that there was a kind of a psychological element to this whole crisis, in addition to the technical element, and that if we get people terrified and panicked about one more new thing, it only makes it harder for us to get out of this dreadful position we're in. So that's an example. I hope you can take it as a kind of confession that there are places and times for intervention by a managerial class, but they are very far and few between, and they have to be short-term, and they have to be subject to ultimate scrutiny, and they have to be very respective of the popular mandates that are at the root of our social contract.
Yeah, the fight about financial markets and probably in these days you could probably say the same thing about sort of big tech in a lot of ways, is that you essentially have these institutions that are going to be run by the professional managerial class either way, right? That is that the sort of people in their local communities, regardless of their wisdom, have very little influence over how investment banks and hedge funds conduct themselves, over the decisions that Google makes. And so I think a lot of the tension that folks are trying to grapple with today is, there's sort of the famous throwaway line, well, build your own Google, which is sort of, the sort of free market ideal of, well, in fact, this will take care of itself, because if people don't like what Google's doing, they'll just go create another one, which I think is probably not quite plausible. And so I think something that a lot of folks on the right are grappling with is the question of, okay, well, you have this class on Wall Street that is running the financial system, in essence. The question is, to what extent do you want to have public oversight or constraints on it, versus to what extent do you want to let it run free? Right. And likewise, you're talking about big tech, and there's essentially more of an antitrust question. To what extent should businesses be as big and powerful as they can successfully be, versus to what extent do you want to have a public intervention in that at some point? And there, I guess the question is sort of, well, which approach best vindicates the kind of populism you're talking about? Is the ordinary American best served by the private sector elites essentially pursuing profit in the market, or are they better served by a government that at least purportedly represents them in their interest to some extent, playing a role in that? Well,
process? We certainly need some oversight, but I just want to point out that as a practical matter, Oren, that oversight is generally so clumsy and so stultifying and so awful. What would be an example? Let me give you an example. I don't know if our listeners realize the Pentagon has an oversight audit every year. The Pentagon is audited, and they say, where did your money go? And what did you get for it? Do people realize that for the last 7 years, the Pentagon has failed that audit? I don't mean once. I don't mean twice. I mean, for the last 7 years, they failed this audit. They can't answer, where did the money go, or what did we get for it? And life just goes on, and the wheel turns, and nobody shuts anything down, or nobody intervenes in a strong way. So many of these oversight processes that are set up by these alphabet soup agencies are not only are they not solutions, but they just kind of enable the dysfunction in many cases. So I think in many cases, whatever kind of auditing or oversight we want is going to have to come from other places. And the very best place, I would argue, is we need to be able to rely on wise experts who are not everyday people to be populists. And you say, well, that sounds like a contradiction in terms. It's not at all. And I'm getting a lot of questions these days about people saying, what the hell? Elon Musk is running things. That's not populism. And I say, actually, it is. Elon Musk is the richest man in the world. And when he hires people for his enterprises, he looks for the top 1%, maybe the top 1% of the top 1%. He's not hiring ordinary Americans. But Elon Musk is smart enough to recognize that when you come to the really important crux decisions in society, you want those made by a cross-section of average people rather than by the smart Alex. And you say, well, how do you know that other than the fact that he's helping Trump? Well, look at what he did with his own latest purchase, X. He got rid of this horrible censorship system that all of the techies had adopted, where you anoint a very small group of completely untransparent, opaque experts to decide what is an acceptable post and what's an unacceptable post. And those people probably had more than their share of PhDs and MBAs and whatever else. And they made absolutely dreadful decisions. And Musk chucked all that, and he set up his community notes system, which is basically crowdsourcing. He said, let's let a cross section of everyday X users look at these posts and decide that's out of bounds and that's fine. That is populism at work. That is a fundamental devotion and acceptance of the rule of the everyday, the rule of ordinary people. Again, it's, to use the current parlance, it's crowdsourcing, and it's very wise. And that goes way back. I'm sure you remember, Oren, the famous example. There was one of the great English statisticians named Francis Galton went to a county fair, and there was a contest to judge the weight of an ox, and you win a 50-pound prize or something if you get it right. So everybody wrote their guess on a little scrap of paper and put it into a pickle jar or something. And Dalton asked the people who ran this contest, could I have those receipts when you're done? And so he got the pieces of paper, and he went back and he did the math, and he discovered that hundreds of people who voted on what that ox weighed came out within like 1.5 pounds of its actual weight. Profoundly accurate. Now, there were people in there who judged probably 3 times too high and people who judged 3 times too low, but the average was very wise. And that is kind of what we're talking about here. It goes way back. It's a kind of an iron rule of nature and of history and of human affairs, which is that you rarely get egregiously wrong decisions when you trust that massive middle. Now, if it was judging the weight, what would you guess the weight of a Tyrannosaurus Rex was? Probably better to rely on a paleontologist. All right. There are places for expertise. But for most of life, most of the things that we all care about, is the economy good or bad? Is this doctor good or bad? Is this school or teacher preferable or not preferable? Those are places where everyday people not only just should be trusted, but they'll make great decisions. They will make better decisions than any alternative board of experts.
Well, we will leave things there. This has been a fantastic conversation. Karl Zinsmeister, author of Backbone. Thank you very much for making the time.
My pleasure.
And we will be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass podcast.